The lunch rush was in full swing at Sunnyside Diner, one of the most popular locations of the chain in downtown Atlanta. Helen Parker, a 25-year-old waitress, darted between tables with a practiced smile that barely masked her exhaustion. She was efficient, sharp-tongued when she wanted to be, and undeniably ambitious. But ambition often bred impatience, and Helen had long decided she was too good for this job. Table 7 needs a refill on coffee, called Jenny Collins, the restaurant's manager, from across the counter. Helen, balancing a tray of burgers and fries, rolled her eyes. Got it, she snapped back, though she had no intention of rushing. Jenny might have been her boss, but Helen liked to think she was smarter than most people there, including her manager. This job was temporary, after all. A stepping stone. Just until she figured out her real career. As Helen weaved through the busy dining area, her gaze landed on the entrance, where the bell above the door jingled softly. An older couple walked in, arm in arm. They were well-dressed, the man in a neatly pressed navy blazer and the woman in a pale pink sweater set, pearls around her neck. Their clothes spoke of old money, but their demeanor was quiet, almost humble. Helen's practiced eye assessed them quickly. Great, she muttered under her breath. Another "we'll sit here for hours eve nothing" type. Helen had served enough elderly couples to make up her mind about them. They rarely tipped well. They asked endless questions about the menu, and they expected impeccable service, without appreciating it. She didn't have the patience for it today. She spun on her heel, determined to leave them to another server, but Jenny caught her before she made it halfway to the kitchen. Helen, Jenny called firmly, stepping into her path. You're free. Can you take the new tables? Helen hesitated, a frown tugging at her lips. I'm swamped, she lied, gesturing vaguely to the tables she was handling. Maya can get them. Jenny narrowed her eyes. Maya's covering the patio. They're in your section. Just take the table. There was no use arguing. With a forced smile, Helen grabbed 2 menus and approached the couple, though she slowed her pace deliberately, just enough to make them wait. Hi there, she said in her most artificial tone as she slapped the menus onto the table. Welcome to Sunnyside Diner. Can I get you started with some drinks? The older man, Robert, looked up at her with a polite smile, but his piercing blue eyes seemed to study her carefully. Thank you. We'll take a moment to look at the menu, if that's all right. Helen crossed her arms.
Sure.
I'll be back. She spun around and walked away before they could say another word, the faintest flicker of annoyance crossing Robert's face. His wife, Martha, reached out to touch his hand across the table, her smile calm and understanding. Don't let it bother you, Martha said softly. She's probably having a bad day. No, Robert replied quietly, his tone steady but sharp. That's not what this is. Minutes ticked by, and Helen made no effort to return to the table. She focused instead on her other customers, laughing at their jokes, ensuring their drinks stayed full. But the longer she avoided the elderly couple, the more she felt the weight of Robert's gaze from across the room. Finally, Jenny approached her again, her arms crossed. What's going on with table 5? She asked, her voice low but stern. They've been sitting there for 15 minutes without ordering. Helen shrugged, feigning innocence. They're taking their time. You know how some people are. Jenny's eyes narrowed. Helen, I don't have time for this. Go to their table.
Now.
Reluctantly, Helen grabbed her notepad and trudged back to the couple, forcing her face into another fake smile. Sorry about the wait. Ready to order, see? Robert didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head, studying her again. What's your name, young lady? He asked, his voice calm but commanding. Helen, she replied a little too curtly. Well, Helen, Robert said, leaning forward slightly. I couldn't help but notice you seem busy today. Is everything all right? Helen stiffened, his question catching her off guard. I'm fine, she said quickly. What can I get for you? Martha, sensing the tension, gently placed a hand on Robert's arm. We'll just have 2 cups of coffee to start, she said warmly. Thank you, dear. Helen scribbled the order on her pad and walked away, her cheeks burning. There was something about Robert's tone that got under her skin, as if he could see straight through her. She hated it. As the lunch rush started to wind down, Helen noticed Robert and Martha chatting quietly at their table. She'd brought them their coffee with a bare minimum of politeness, and they hadn't complained. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Robert was still watching her, and it made her uncomfortable. "What's their deal?" Helen muttered to Maya as she passed by the server station. "They've been nursing those coffees for like an hour." Maya glanced over at the couple. "They seem sweet," she said with a shrug.
"Why?
"Did they say something?" "No," Helen said quickly. "They're just weird." Before Maya could respond, Helen heard her name being called. Jenny stood at the front counter with Robert and Martha, who were ready to pay. Helen froze. Robert was holding out a crisp $50 bill, and Jenny looked over at her with a raised brow. "Helen, can you cash this out for them?" Jenny asked. "Sure," Helen replied, trying to keep her voice steady as she approached the counter. She could feel Robert's eyes on her as she rang up the order and handed him his change. "Thank you," Robert said as he pocketed the money. Then he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Helen, I'd like to have a word with your manager before we leave, if that's all right." Helen's stomach dropped. Sure. I'll let her know." She hurried away before he could say anything else, her heart pounding. What could he possibly want to talk to Jenny about? She tried to shake off her nerves, convincing herself that it couldn't be that serious. But when she glanced back at the counter, she saw Robert speaking to Jenny in a calm but deliberate tone. Martha stood beside him, her expression unreadable. A few minutes later, Jenny called Helen into the back office. Her face was tight with controlled anger. "What did you do to table 5? Jenny demanded, as soon as Helen walked in. Helen blinked, feigning innocence. "What? I didn't do anything." "Really?" Jenny snapped. "Because Mr. Johnson just told me that you ignored them, gave them attitude, and barely provided service." Helen's stomach twisted. "Look, they were just difficult," she said defensively. "And I was busy." Jenny's expression darkened. "Difficult? Helen, do you know who they are?" Helen frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "They're Robert and Martha Johnson," Jenny said, her voice dripping with disbelief. "As in Robert Johnson, the founder of Sunnyside Diner." Helen felt the blood drain from her face. The air in Jenny's office felt heavier than usual. Helen stood rooted in front of her manager, her pulse drumming loudly in her ears. She replayed Jenny's words in her mind, over and over. Robert Johnson, the founder of Sunnyside Diner. Helen's mouth went dry. It couldn't be true. The man she had brushed off, ignored and disrespected, he owned the entire chain? Jenny leaned forward, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Helen, I'm going to ask you this one time. Did you know who they were?"
"What?"
"No." Helen stammered, her voice cracking. "I had no idea. How was I supposed to know?" Jenny's eyes narrowed. It wasn't about knowing who they were. It was about doing your job. She let the silence hang between them before adding, "Robert Johnson doesn't want special treatment. He didn't tell me who he was until the very end. You know why? Because he was giving you, a chance to show who you are." Helen's chest tightened. "Look, I was busy. The lunch rush was crazy, and they didn't seem like what?" Jenny interrupted sharply, her voice cutting through Helen's excuses. "Like they were worth your time?" Helen flinched at the accusation. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She had no defense. Jenny let out a frustrated sigh and rubbed her temples. "Do you even realize how much damage this could have caused? What if they decide to shut this place down? Or fire the entire team because you made us look incompetent? Do you ever think about anyone besides yourself, Helen?" I didn't mean for this to happen," Helen murmured, her voice barely audible. "Well, it did happen," Jenny snapped. "And now you're going to have to face the consequences. Mr. Johnson and his wife are waiting in the dining room. They want to speak with you before they leave." Helen's stomach churned violently.
"What?"
"No, Jenny, please." "This isn't up for debate," Jenny said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You owe them an apology at the very least." Helen's legs felt like they might give out as she turned and walked back into the dining area. The sight of Robert and Martha still sitting at their table made her heart race. They looked so calm, so composed, as if they had all the time in the world. Helen approached slowly, feeling the weight of every step. When she reached the table, Robert looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Martha offered a small, polite smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," Helen began, her voice shaky. I wanted to apologize for earlier. I wasn't as attentive as I should have been, and Stop, Robert interrupted, raising a hand. His tone wasn't angry, but it was firm, authoritative, the kind of voice that commanded respect without needing to demand it. Helen froze, her apology hanging awkwardly in the air. "I appreciate the gesture," Robert said slowly. "But an apology without reflection is just words. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Helen blinked, unsure how to respond. I guess. Robert leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Let me ask you something, Helen. What went through your mind when you first saw us walk in? Be honest." Her face burned. "I don't know." "You do know," Robert said, his voice cutting through her hesitation. "You made a judgment about us before we even sat down, didn't you?" Helen's throat tightened. She wanted to deny it, to claim that he was wrong, but the truth was staring her in the face. I thought you might be difficult customers," she admitted reluctantly. "And why is that?" Helen hesitated. "I guess I assumed you wouldn't leave a good tip." Robert's expression didn't change, but the disappointment in his eyes was unmistakable. Beside him, Martha shifted slightly, her hand resting lightly on her husband's arm. "You judged us," Robert said plainly. "Not on how we treated you, not on how we behaved, but on your assumptions about us. And because of that, you decided we weren't worth your time. Am I wrong?" Helen couldn't meet his gaze. "No," she whispered. Robert nodded, as if her admission had confirmed something he already knew. "You know, Helen, I started Sunnyside Diner with one goal in mind, to create a place where everyone feels welcome, where people are treated with respect, no matter who they are or what they look like." Martha chimed in softly, her voice kind but firm. "When we started this business, we didn't have much. We know what it feels like to be overlooked, to be treated like you don't matter." Robert continued, his tone steady. "That's why we take this so seriously. The way you treated us today, it's the opposite of what this company stands for." Helen felt a lump rise in her throat. She had always thought of herself as a good worker, someone who got the job done. But standing in front of Robert and Martha, she realized how small her vision had been. She had focused on the wrong things, tips, efficiency, appearances, without ever considering the bigger picture. "I'm sorry," she said again, her voice cracking. "I really am." Martha offered her a gentle smile. "We believe you, dear. But the question is, what will you do differently next time?" Helen swallowed hard. I'll treat everyone the way I should have treated you. With respect." Robert studied her for a long moment before nodding. "We'll see." He stood, adjusting his blazer, and Martha followed suit. As they prepared to leave, Robert pulled a small envelope from his pocket and handed it to her.
"One more thing," he said. "Take this.
And think about what we've said." Helen accepted the envelope with trembling hands, unsure of what it contained. Robert and Martha walked out without another word, leaving her standing in stunned silence. Back in the break room, Helen sat alone, staring at the envelope. She felt too ashamed to open it, but her curiosity got the better of her. Inside was a single piece of paper, a letter on Sunnyside Diner's official letterhead.
It read,
*Helen. Every employee at Sunnyside Diner has the potential to grow, to lead, and to become something more. We believe in second chances, but only if you're willing to work for it. This envelope represents an opportunity, a chance to participate in our employee investor program, a pathway to leadership within this company. But it's not automatic, it's earned. Think carefully about the kind of person you want to be, both in this job and in life. Robert Johnson, *. Helen's hands trembled as she read the letter over and over. The humiliation she had felt earlier was nothing compared to the weight of this moment. She had come so close to throwing everything away, not just a paycheck, but a future she hadn't even realized was possible. For the first time in a long time, Helen felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just guilt, it was resolve. Helen woke up the next morning feeling as if the air around her had thickened, pressing down on her chest. The letter from Robert Johnson sat on her nightstand, its presence both intimidating and oddly motivating. She hadn't been able to sleep after reading it the first time, her mind racing with questions. What was the Employee Investor Program? Why would they offer this opportunity to me, of all people? After how I acted, do they really think I'm capable of change? But the most unsettling question of all lingered in her mind like a shadow. Do I believe I'm capable of change? She sighed heavily, brushing her hair into a messy ponytail before grabbing her uniform. Another shift at Sunnyside Diner loomed ahead, but today felt different. The letter had cracked something open inside her, an uncomfortable truth about herself that she could no longer ignore. The diner was quieter than usual when Helen arrived for her mid-morning shift. The lunch rush hadn't started yet, and the faint hum of country music played from the speakers. Maya was folding napkins at the server station, and Jenny stood near the front counter, checking schedules on her clipboard. Both women looked up when Helen walked in, their expressions unreadable. "Morning," Helen said cautiously. Maya gave her a small nod, her usual bubbly demeanor subdued. Jenny, on the other hand, didn't respond immediately. She just stared at Helen for a long moment before setting down her clipboard. "Come with me," Jenny said, her tone flat but authoritative. Helen's stomach sank. Without a word, she followed Jenny into the back office, where the tension from the previous day still seemed to linger in the air. Jenny shut the door behind them and crossed her arms. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened yesterday," Jenny began, her voice measured but firm. "And I need to know where your head is at. Because if you're not serious about making changes, Helen, I can't keep you here. Not after what Robert and Martha saw." Helen felt her chest tighten. "Jenny, I know I messed up," she said quickly. "And I know I have a lot to work on. But I want to make things right. I really do." Jenny studied her carefully, as if trying to gauge the sincerity of her words. After a long pause, she reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a thick folder, sliding it across the table to Helen. "This is everything you need to know about the Employee Investor Program," Jenny said. "It's not something we talk about openly, because it's only offered to employees who've shown leadership potential, or, in your case, employees who've been given one last chance to prove themselves." Helen opened the folder, her eyes scanning the first page. The program was designed to train employees in all aspects of the business: management, operations, customer service, with the ultimate goal of helping them become stakeholders in the company. It was a fast track to leadership, but the requirements were rigorous. Candidates had to complete extensive training, demonstrate exceptional performance, and pass a series of evaluations. This is a big deal," Helen murmured, almost to herself. "It is," Jenny agreed. "And Robert doesn't offer this opportunity lightly. He believes in second chances, but only for people who are willing to put in the work. So the question is, are you?" Helen swallowed hard.
Yes.
"I am." Jenny's expression softened slightly, but her tone remained serious. "Then prove it. Starting today." Back on the floor, Helen felt like she was walking on eggshells. Every interaction with customers felt heavier, more significant, as if the weight of Robert and Martha's expectations hung over her head. She forced herself to smile more, to be more attentive, but it all felt awkward and forced. She wasn't used to putting so much effort into her work, and the strain was obvious. "Table 4 needs a refill," Maya said, nudging her gently as they passed each other near the coffee station. "I got it," Helen replied quickly, grabbing the coffee pot and heading to the table. The customers, a young couple with a toddler in a high chair, barely looked up as she poured their drinks. The baby squealed loudly, throwing a piece of toast onto the floor, and Helen instinctively frowned. "Sorry about that," the mother said, glancing up with an apologetic smile. "He's at that age where he throws everything." Helen forced a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. "It's fine," she said, quickly walking away before the mess could bother her more. From the corner of her eye, She noticed Jenny watching her from the counter, her expression unreadable. Helen knew she was being evaluated every second of the shift, and the pressure was starting to get to her. During her break, Helen sat alone in the staff lounge, flipping through the folder Jenny had given her. The more she read about the program, the more overwhelmed she felt. The expectations were so high, higher than anything she had ever aspired to. Part of her wondered if Robert and Martha had made a mistake by offering it to her. What if she wasn't cut out for this? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door creaking open. Maya stepped inside, holding 2 cans of soda. She handed one to Helen without a word and sat down across from her. "You okay?" Maya asked after a moment. Helen hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. "It feels like everyone's waiting for me to fail." Maya tilted her head. "Maybe. But it's also possible they're waiting to see if you'll rise to the occasion." Helen let out a bitter laugh. "Easier said than done." Maya smiled faintly. "You know, when I first started working here, I was terrible at my job. I spilled drinks, forgot orders, you name it. But Jenny saw something in me and gave me a chance to improve. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it." Helen looked down at the folder in her lap. "What if I'm not good enough?" "Then work harder," Maya said simply. "Prove yourself wrong." By the end of her shift, Helen felt drained but determined. She stayed late to help clean up, something she never used to do. Jenny noticed and gave her a small nod of approval, though she didn't say much. As Helen walked out of the diner that evening, she felt a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. The road ahead seemed daunting, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a purpose, something worth striving for. The letter from Robert had been right. It wasn't about what she said, but what she did. And she was finally ready to start proving it. The days that followed felt like a blur of effort and self-doubt. Helen threw herself into her work, determined to prove that she was serious about change. But the more she tried, the more obvious her shortcomings seemed to become. Every mistake, every misstep, felt magnified under the weight of Jenny's watchful eyes and her co-workers' cautious glances. It wasn't just about getting through her shifts anymore. She was being tested, and it wasn't going to be easy. Helen was wiping down a table near the window when she heard a sharp clatter behind her. She turned just in time to see Maya struggling with a tray of drinks that was tipping dangerously to one side. Without thinking, Helen rushed over and caught the tray before it hit the ground.
"Got it,"
Helen said, steadying the drinks. Maya let out a relieved laugh. "Thanks. I thought I was about to end up with iced tea all over me." Helen handed the tray back to her, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "No problem. I've been there." Maya paused, looking at Helen with a hint of surprise. "You're really trying, aren't you?" Helen shrugged, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "I guess I am." Maya's expression softened. "You know, people notice when someone puts in the effort, even if they don't say anything right away." Before Helen could respond, Jenny appeared behind the counter, her sharp voice cutting through their conversation. "Helen, Table 8's been waiting on their drinks for 10 minutes. Let's move." Helen felt her stomach tighten as the brief moment of encouragement dissolved. "On it," she called back, hurrying to the drink station. As the day wore on, Helen found herself slipping back into old habits. The lunch rush brought out the worst in her. The impatience, the forced smiles, the urge to cut corners just to get through it all. By the time her break rolled around, she felt drained and frustrated. She slumped into a chair in the staff lounge, staring blankly at the folder Jenny had given her. She hadn't opened it since the first day, afraid of what she might find. The program felt like a mountain she wasn't sure she could climb. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Jenny entered the room, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. She sat down across from Helen, her expression unreadable. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," Jenny said, taking a sip of her coffee. Helen hesitated before responding. "It feels like it sometimes." Jenny set her cup down and leaned forward slightly. "Look, Helen, I'm going to be honest with you. Robert and Martha gave you a chance because they saw potential in you. But potential doesn't mean anything if you don't follow through. I'm trying," Helen said, her voice tinged with frustration. But it feels like no matter what I do, it's not enough. Jenny raised an eyebrow. And what did you expect? That 1 week of effort would erase years of bad habits. Change takes time, Helen. And it's not just about working harder. It's about working smarter. Listening to feedback. Being willing to learn. Helen frowned, staring down at the table. It's just overwhelming. Jenny sighed, her tone softening slightly. Of course it's overwhelming. Growth always is. But you have to decide if it's worth it. No one can make that decision for you. That evening, Helen stayed late again, scrubbing down the counters and organizing the condiment station. She noticed Jenny lingering near the register, watching her silently. Helen wasn't sure if the scrutiny made her feel motivated or uneasy. As she finished cleaning, Maya approached with a sly grin. Staying late 2 days in a row? Who are you, and what have you done with the old Helen? Helen rolled her eyes, but there was no malice in it. Very funny. I'm serious, Maya said, her tone turning thoughtful. It's kind of impressive. You could have just quit, you know. Most people would have. Helen hesitated. I thought about it, but I don't know. I guess I want to prove to myself that I'm not the person I've been acting like. Maya smiled. Well, for what it's worth, I think you're on the right track. The next morning, Helen arrived at work early, determined to make a good impression. She greeted each of her coworkers with a genuine smile and even offered to help Maya set up the coffee station. When the first customers of the day walked in, a family with 2 young children, Helen approached their table with a calm, friendly demeanor. She took their order carefully, repeating it back to them to make sure she got it right. As the morning went on, she found herself falling into a rhythm. She was still making mistakes, mixing up orders, forgetting to refill drinks, but instead of getting defensive, she owned up to them. When a customer pointed out that she'd brought the wrong side dish, she apologized sincerely and fixed it immediately. By the time the lunch rush began, Helen felt a small spark of hope. She wasn't perfect, but she was trying. And for the first time, it felt like that might be enough. Toward the end of her shift, Jenny pulled her aside. Can I talk to you for a second? Helen's heart sank. She followed Jenny to the back office, bracing herself for more criticism. But when Jenny closed the door, her expression was surprisingly neutral. I've been watching you these past few days, Jenny began. And I'll admit, I wasn't sure if you'd stick it out. But you've been putting in the effort, and that counts for something. Helen blinked, unsure how to respond. Thanks, she said cautiously. But Jenny continued, you've still got a long way to go. This isn't just about showing up on time and smiling at customers. It's about changing the way you think about your work and about the people around you. That's not going to happen overnight. I know, Helen said quietly. I'm just trying to take it one step at a time. Jenny nodded. That's all you can do. But remember this, Robert and Martha gave you this opportunity because they believe in what this company stands for. Respect, kindness, integrity. If you don't embody those values, then this isn't the place for you. Helen swallowed hard. I understand. Good, Jenny said. Now go finish cleaning the drink station. Helen left the office feeling both humbled and motivated. Jenny's words had struck a chord. She realized that the changes she needed to make weren't just about her job, they were about who she was as a person. By the end of the week, Helen felt a small but noticeable shift in her coworkers' attitudes. Maya joked with her more often, and even Jenny seemed less tense when giving her instructions. The customers, too, responded to her new approach. A middle-aged woman with 2 teenagers had thanked her for being so attentive, and a young couple had left her a generous tip along with a handwritten note that read, "Great service. Keep it up." For the first time in a long time, Helen felt like she was on the right path. But she knew the hardest part was still ahead. Changing her habits was one thing. Changing her mindset was another. 2 weeks after the disastrous visit from Robert and Martha Johnson, Helen found herself in unfamiliar territory. The tension and uncertainty she'd felt at the beginning of this journey hadn't entirely disappeared, but something new had started to grow in its place. Pride. Not the selfish, self-centered kind of pride she had always clung to, but the quiet, hard-earned kind that came from knowing she was putting in the work. Her days had fallen into a steady rhythm. Arrive early, prep her station, greet every customer with sincerity, and go out of her way to help her coworkers whenever she could. Mistakes still happened, because mistakes were inevitable, but Helen was learning to own them, to apologize without defensiveness, and to see them as opportunities rather than failures. It was a busy Thursday evening when Helen was tested in a way she hadn't anticipated. The diner was packed with customers, the line for tables stretching out the door. Every server was on edge, moving at breakneck speed to keep up with the demand. Helen had just finished clearing a table when Jenny approached her, her expression serious. "Helen, we've got a VIP party coming in," Jenny said. "Table 7. I want you to take it." Helen froze. "A VIP party? Are you sure?" Jenny raised an eyebrow. "Do you think you're not ready?" Helen swallowed hard. "No, I'll take it." Jenny nodded.
Good.
"They're important, so treat them well. I'll be watching." Helen's nerves buzzed as she prepared the table, making sure every detail was perfect. When the party arrived, her breath caught in her throat. It was Robert and Martha Johnson, this time accompanied by several other people, all of them sharply dressed and radiating an air of authority. Helen forced herself to smile as she approached the table. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Welcome to Sunnyside Diner. My name is Helen, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." Robert looked up at her, his piercing blue eyes meeting hers. For a moment, he said nothing, and Helen felt her pulse quicken. But then, to her relief, he smiled. "Thank you, Helen," he said simply. The next hour felt like the ultimate test of everything Helen had been working toward. She moved between the kitchen and the table with precision, ensuring that every drink was refilled, every dish was perfect, and every request was met with genuine attentiveness. When one of the guests asked for a special substitution, she handled it without hesitation, double-checking with the kitchen to make sure it was done right. Throughout the meal, Helen couldn't help but notice Robert watching her. His expression was calm, unreadable, but she felt his silent evaluation in every interaction. Martha, on the other hand, offered warm smiles and kind words that helped ease some of Helen's tension. As the party finished their meal, Helen returned to the table with a tray of dessert menus. "Would anyone like to see our dessert options tonight?" she asked, her tone professional yet friendly. Robert shook his head. "No, thank you. I think we've had all we need." Helen nodded, preparing to clear the table, but Robert held up a hand to stop her. "Helen," he said, his voice steady but kind. "Sit with us for a moment." Helen blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, I'm not sure I'm allowed to." "I'm the owner," Robert said with a small smile. "I think I can make an exception." The other guests chuckled softly as Helen hesitated before pulling up a chair. She folded her hands in her lap, feeling the weight of their gazes on her. "You've come a long way in just a few weeks," Robert began. "When Martha and I first met you, I'll admit, we weren't impressed." Helen's cheeks flushed, but she nodded, accepting his words. "But," Robert continued, "what matters isn't where you start, it's how you respond to challenges. And I've seen enough to know that you've taken this challenge seriously." Helen felt a lump rise in her throat. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a lot." "It should," Robert replied, "because this isn't just about being a good server. It's about being the kind of person who lifts others up, who treats everyone with respect, no matter who they are. That's what Sunnyside Diner is built on. And that's what we expect from anyone who wants to grow with this company." Martha leaned forward, her kind smile radiating warmth. "We've all made mistakes, Helen. What matters is what you do next." Helen nodded, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "I want to keep growing. I know I have a lot to learn, but I'm willing to put in the work." Robert studied her for a moment before pulling an envelope from his blazer pocket. He slid it across the table to her, and Helen's breath caught as she recognized the Sunnyside Diner logo on the front. "This," Robert said, "is an official invitation to the next phase of the Employee Investor Program. It's not an easy path, but it's one that could lead to a management position and beyond, if you're willing to put in the effort." Helen stared at the envelope, her hands trembling slightly as she picked it up.
I
don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, Robert said with a small smile. This isn't a decision to take lightly. But if you choose to accept it, know that we'll be watching and supporting you every step of the way. That night, after the diner had closed and the lights were dimmed, Helen sat alone at one of the corner booths, the envelope still in her hands. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the contents. It detailed the next steps of the program: leadership training, mentoring sessions, performance evaluations. It was daunting, to say the least. But as she read, Helen felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She thought back to the person she had been just a few weeks ago, judgmental, impatient, unwilling to see beyond her own frustrations. She wasn't proud of that version of herself, but she was grateful for the wake-up call that Robert and Martha had given her. Helen folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. She had a long road ahead, but for the first time, she felt ready to walk it. The next morning, Helen arrived at the diner early, just as the sun was beginning to rise. She stood outside for a moment, staring at the familiar neon sign that read Sunnyside Diner. It wasn't just a restaurant to her anymore. It was a place where she had learned some of the hardest and most valuable lessons of her life. With a deep breath, she walked inside, determined to make the most of this second chance.